integration of public schools in Virginia in 1958.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight. We're going to wait just a minute or two and let give people time to enter here. Well, we've got 33 people with us. So why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm the Reader Services Librarian at the Williamsburg Regional Library. Welcome to this event in our One Book, One Community series on Stamped, which is brought to you by Williamsburg Regional Library, William and Mary, and the Friends of Williamsburg Regional Library Foundation. Our next event, February 22nd, is a virtual visit with Jason Reynolds, the author of Stamped. Please go to wrl.org/onebook for more resources and events, including recordings of previous programs that we have done. Our guest tonight is Steve Prince. He is a native of New Orleans and currently resides here in Williamsburg. He is an award-winning artist, the 2010 Teacher of the Year for the City of Hampton, a 2020 recipient of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts grant, co-recipient of National Performance Network Creation Fund, and the 2020 Grand Prize Visual Art winner of the Engage Art Competition. He has shown his art internationally in various solo, group, and juried exhibitions, participated in several residencies, including artist in residence at the Segura Art Center in Notre Dame, Pyramid Atlantic Art Center in Hyattsville, Maryland, the Atlanta Printmaker Studio, the University of Iowa, and the University of Tennessee, to name a few. He's currently the Director of Engagement and the Distinguished Artist in Residence at the Muscarelli Museum here at William and Mary. He received his BFA from Xavier University of Louisiana and his MFA in Printmaking and Sculpture from Michigan State University. He's a mixed media artist, a master printmaker, a lecturer, educator, and art evangelist. I love that term. Has taught middle school, high school, community college, four-year public and four-year private schools, and has conducted workshops internationally in various media. As an artist, he's represented by Black Art in America in Columbus, Georgia, Zuko Gallery in Atlanta, and Stella Jones Gallery in New Orleans. I think other than behavior that's taught and modeled by the people, especially the adults around us in our formative years, images probably carry the greatest weight in creating our perception of race and the impact that it has on our treatment of people who are different from us. Steve, would you tell us, lead us through the role of images in the culture of racism?
Indeed. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction and this opportunity to share. I consider it both a privilege and an honor to be able to do so. And I thank you all for taking out the time of your evening to join us here to have a discussion about race and representation and about the power of images. I must say that artwork and images is something that I've dedicated my life to. I knew that ever since I was 5 years old that I would be an artist. As I remember being a little child and standing in front of the class and the teacher asking you to stand up and state your name and to say what you want to be. And the words that used to flow from my mouth is, and exactly, I would say, I want to be like Michelangelo. And I would say that is because of the images that I saw inside the encyclopedias that were in my home. My dad was a big stickler for reading, and he really pushed all of us to read. As a matter of fact, I had to give reports to him almost weekly on the different things that I was reading. And he would drop a book off and he would come to his room and to tell me what was going on in that book. And if I didn't, then anything that I want to do, he said, stop it, read the book. So I remember those days. I remember reading, and I remember the images that I saw within those books and within the annals of the text. And I know the power of images and the power of the visual text and how it's impacted us. Before I get into my presentation, which I basically broke it up into 3 different sections. One, I was going to just share just a few of some of the historicized images that have been damaging so socially and societally, that have impacted not only us in an American context, but has affected us globally. Secondly, I will share with you a series of artists that have impacted me as a visual artist, and that I have chosen to take the path to follow in the footsteps of so many that went before me. And I'm just going to share just a few of them with you and talk a little bit about their work and the ways in which they amplified history, but in ways in which they uplifted a people through the work. And then thirdly, I'm going to go into some of my own personal work that follows in that history, that challenges that past, but challenges us right now for us to envision who we can become in the future. Before I get into my PowerPoint presentation, I want to tell a little story to you. It was about 2006 or 2007. I can't remember the exact year, but I think it was 2007. I was invited to Santa Catarina, Brazil. That is on the southern part of Brazil, a little bit above Uruguay. I was invited there as a resident artist to be there for about a month. It was an absolute beautiful trip. It was the first time that I made an international flight of that length out of the country. So I was overjoyed to be able to land down in Santa Catarina and to be able to share with the people there. The first town I went to was called Florianopolis. I was there for about a little over a week. And my host family of Zelio and his wife, Marilyn, they just took absolute great care of me. They got me in their car and they drove me from several miles and for several hours. We got to the next township. It was called Blumenau. And there I was supposed to work with the Blumenau Art Museum in order to do some work. But before we got there, we went to the director's home. And I remember I was tired, because I guess I was feeling a little bit of the accent of the jet lag that I experienced from flying all the way down there in a week of expression and teaching that I was doing. And I got to the woman's house and I just plopped myself down on her couch. And Marilyn and Zelio began to talk to the museum director, and they were speaking Portuguese. And I speak very little Portuguese. The museum director had a little girl. She's probably about, I'll say 9 or 10 years old. And she spoke a little English as well. And so the two of us just struck up a conversation, and most of it was me pantomiming, making faces and dancing in front of the little girl. And she just made them right back at me. So I told her, I did like this. I held my finger up to tell her to stop. And then she stood and I told her to pose for me. So I got out my sketch pad and I began to make a drawing of her. And I'm doing it really quick, making it really fast. And she's just smiling away. Her cheeks are turning rose red. And I'm drawing her. And then I turn around to her and she just lights up. And I tear it out of my book and I give it to her. The girl runs off. She goes into the back room. A few seconds later, she comes back out and she has her pad. And she asked me to pose for her. So I got in position and I posed for her and she drew me. And then she turned it to me and I gave her the same reaction that she gave me. I went, and then I took the picture from her. The mom said on 3 occasions in my interaction with the little girl, said to her, "Stop bothering the gentleman." And I turned to the mom, I said, "She's not bothering me. It's all right. I would say I work with kids all the time." And then she said, the third time she said it, it struck a chord inside of me. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I needed to divest my time for interacting with the little girl. So I did. I turned to the adults and I began to talk to them. A week and a half went by. I did several workshops in the museum. The community came out in droves. Each workshop I did, they came out even more. By the end of my time there, we went out to dinner. So I was sitting with Zelia Marilini and the museum director, and she was sitting directly across from me as if you are sitting right across from me inside this computer screen. And she said to me, "Steve, I want to apologize to you." And I was like, for what? She said, "When you got here, I was afraid of you being around my daughter." And then I immediately turned it back to myself because I started to wonder, did I do something that was culturally off-putting that could have, that bothered her? And I said, if I did something in interacting with your child that was offensive, please forgive me. I had no intention of harming your child in any way. I said, I remember in meeting with her and interacting with her, I just was trying to be friendly. She said, "No, you did nothing wrong." She said, "It's my problem." She said, "It is the images of Black men that I see in movies and in videos that scared me when you came into my house. That absolutely floored me. I never forget the feeling. It felt like my entire insides dropped. And I just looked at this woman. I said, you mean to tell me videos and movies that you've seen of a Black man from America is what scared you?" And so when we talk about images and we talk about the depths of images, I want to make sure that you remember that story, because that was just one story, or one instance that a person was able to articulate to me and say to me the issue that was going on, and had the boldness and had the courage to say it to my face. I said back to her, "I forgive you." And I thanked her for telling me that. Then the rest of our dinner was in conversation around the fact of the power of images and how they circulate and the damaging effects of them, and the importance of really looking at a person not based on the color of their skin or the stories that are constructed that have come from the past, but to engage a person for their humanity and the depths of their character. So now I'll share with you my presentation. I titled my talk, "A Picture is Worth 1,000 Words: The Historical Fight Against Racist Imagery in Popular Culture." And looking at the text of Stamped and Racism and Anti-Racism in You, there were three different elements that were recurring throughout that text that I think is very important as we begin to think about the various things I'm going to share with you visually. And one of those ideas was, in the text, it talks about this idea of segregationists, those who are outwardly acting out of that space of racism and wanting to maintain power that was established from long ago. The assimilationists, the ones that want you to conform, the ones who want you to be more like them and less of you. And the third are the anti-racists, those who accept you for who you are and allow you to be your fullest self, and do not get in the way to make sure that we can have an authentic relationship built on love and trust and faith. I think we need to just deal with the current history. This is something that just happened not even a week ago. The Indianapolis Museum of Art apologizes for insensitive job posting. The museum wrote that it was seeking a director who would work to maintain its core white art audience, in addition to attracting a more diverse one. There's so many problems in just that one simple phrase in terms of keeping its core white audience. And after they apologized, the one word that they removed from the whole job posting was white, to keep its core art audience. As if to suggest that by removing that one word, that now it no longer carries the power of its intent. I challenge this whole construct to basically say that it should just simply be one of trying to create a more diverse space, but not worrying about losing that base, not worrying about offending someone because you want to make a place more inclusive. These ideas, these constructs, if we begin to look and think about the power of images, one of the most powerful images that have happened in the time of history came through a film that premiered in 1915. It was the very first film to ever be premiered inside of the White House in Washington, D.C. D.W. Griffin's The Birth of a Nation, which comes from a book that was called The Klansman. This very important film really speaks to the depths of some of the ways in which these images have been purported throughout time, and how the damages are, we're still feeling its effects as it relates to Black masculinity and Black femininity, as it relates to these foundations of Klansmen and dealing with power structures and dealing with fear, dealing with greed, and all these different things that are operating systemically around us that we see and we don't see, or should I say we see and we choose not to see. The images are so pervasive that they just become almost secondhand, or that's become second nature, and that they just flow from our lips and all around us, that these are the kind of images of the past that we're bombarded with. But these images had more impacting with it beyond just simply a negative imagery, showing this Black woman on the left and showing her getting a lighter skin, and now she is much happier because her skin is closer to that of her white counterpart. And that this idea of darkness is also continuing to be situated as these constructs of evil. The negative structures of people eating watermelon, the large enlarged lips, and the stereotypic stage shows and of minstrelsy going on, and these images of eating watermelon, eating fried chicken, and eating greasy lips, and all these different constructs of movies being made, and television programs and stage programs being made, all purporting again these negative images and these imagery and these layers of information that continues to come at us down into our everyday items as we eat our wonderful little pancakes on a Sunday morning. The effects of these images do not just affect the one in which it's speaking of, it also affects the one who is partaking in it as well. Games with images layered on top of them, card games that speaks about putting kids inside of jail cells, books being written like Agatha Christie's book, And Then There Were None, which was first titled The Tin Little. Or over in Europe, Saartjie Baartman, who they changed her name to the Hottentot Venus, who they put this woman on display because of her large buttocks. And they made her into a sideshow, a freak show. And some of the images and the imagery as it relates to Black women and Black femininity and the hypersexual natures and the constructions of Black women and men are being displayed right here within this construct as they poked and they prodded at this woman as if she were another animal inside of a cage. It even goes forward into like 2011 when one of the congressmen made a statement about the scale of Michelle Obama's backside and saying that she's supposed to be the person that's leading our country to good health. But look at her backside. These constructions are embedded within the fabric of our nation. Over and over again, this idea of the Black male and his pursuit of the white female, and this image is alluding to World War I enlistment imagery, but this image is very much embedded in the psyche of America. It goes back to that film that I just shared with you at the very beginning of the presentation, down to the images that become eerie reflections of that past. Image of LeBron James on the cover of Vogue. And it's almost like, how could they forget of these constructs? Or did they forget? Is it just part of our subconscious, or is it part of the consciousness of us that we make these images? A whole host of artists have fought for many years to fight for the dignity, the power of the African-American community. And one of those vanguards was Jacob Lawrence, who back in the 40s and 50s, he was documenting the story of the migration series of African-Americans leaving from the South because of the harshness of it and dealing with Jim Crow laws and trying to move to the North and find some space of respite, find better jobs. But as this panel indicates, food had doubled in price because of the war. As you see the mother working at the fatback, trying to provide for her child, trying to keep the house afloat, while perhaps the husband is out working in the community, trying to bring home the bread. We had other artists like Romare Bearden, and he creates the image called The Empress of the Blues, as he's documenting what is going on inside of Harlem, and the Harlem Renaissance, and all these different people with the high intellect are working together. Musicians and artists are working inside of this space, but each and every one of them are dealing with all of these images and all of these representations and all these glass ceilings and all these closed doors and all these ways in which they are pushed out of their communal spaces and forced into smaller spaces, and they're not allowed to move. Even in the show, the dense packed nature of the composition that he creates bespeaks of, yes, we were able to create a way out of no way, but even in the midst of that struggle, there's a fight going on internally and externally at the same time. Great artists like Elizabeth Catlett, she was able to see where her mom and her aunts and her family, where they came from the fields, are proud and strong people. So she showed the representation of the dignity of this woman who's a sharecropper, someone that she knew very deeply. She showed the strength and the power because these images were used to uplift the people, to uplift those who were seeing it, that they can see themselves represented upon the page, and not like those images that see them acting as buffoons or creating them as less than human and creating them as chattel. Or Elizabeth Catlett's representation of Harriet digging back into the history and knowing that she saved hundreds of people. And as Harriet Tubman said, I could have saved hundreds more if they knew they were slaves. The education of the African American through the ways in which we utilize art, the ways in which we utilize information and education, that is our way in which we break down and we deconstruct these cycles that are got us all trapped in such a really vicious cycle of repeat. She was speaking out against the lynchings and speaking from a mother's love for her child and a special fear for my loved ones. She was not only fearing for her loved ones, she's fearing for her own seed that came from her womb. And she makes an allusion to a guy named William Patterson, who was a very integral lawyer in New York and who creates the Civil Rights Congress. And he was helping to protect those children that were being put into what are called kangaroo courts. And for those of you who don't know what a kangaroo court is that one you just kind of go through the motions and you already have the verdict. Or Charles White, again, showing the dignity and the strength of the workers of the fields, those who are working to provide, and deconstructing this image of the lazy Black man or the lazy Black woman, those who do not want to work for their lives and those who do not want to provide. These are some of the images and the imagery and the information and the text that has been spread so like a virus all throughout this nation for hundreds of years. And these are parts of the things in which we've been fighting for equally the same amount of time. Or the beautiful mural that Charles White's created is called The Contribution of the Negro to American Democracy. This is not far from where we're at right now here in Williamsburg. This image is on the campus of Hampton University, which is about 30 minutes up the road. If you go into Clark Hall, which is where the music building is located, you will see up on the second floor this beautiful fresco that was created on the wall, and he began to show the different people throughout history, from Crispus Attucks to Frederick Douglass to Sojourner Truth to Booker T. Washington, and the list goes on of different people, musicians and artists and thinkers, all embedded within us to show our humanity again and again, because that pressure was on the African turned American to trying to say that we were less than human. The art reflecting the issues of the time. In that year of '63, we had the Great March on Washington. But just a month later, you had a bombing in Birmingham. And 4 little girls down in the basement just stepped out of the bathroom and put lip gloss on. A bomb went off and they died. And Charles White began to create an image out of the rubble. He began to play around with the sticks and the wood and trying to make sense of this insanity that has attacked not only our children, but has attacked our children's children, that has attacked our mothers and our fathers, our brothers and our sisters. This heinous virus called racism has affected us so deeply. But we continue to fight. Ye shall inherit the earth and work. We continue to show the beauty and the dignity and the strength, the vitality, the love of self is expressed through the artist's work. Faith Ringwald creates this image in 1967. I know that it was right following on the heels of a great 1967 riot that takes place in Detroit, where she sees white people and Black people in a battle for life and death. And the question and the wonder within the heart of the artist is, when will this insanity stop? When will the violence and the chaos stop within our communities? When will the killing stop? When will the dying stop? In these ways in which comes again off the heels of something that is embedded deep into the fabric of our nation. And John Biggers, who was a student at Hampton University, who got an opportunity to meet Charles White and Elizabeth Catlin when they came through at that particular time, he then begins to pick up the baton and he begins to create his own line of images. He's now speaking of those cotton pickers. And I hear the song in my head, and the cotton is high. That whole song and that line about saying the cotton is high, that was supposed to be a good thing because the cotton's a little easy to pick. But in this context of this image, don't look like the cotton's high. It looks like it's low, just like the people in terms of their expression. But they keep on moving. And Biggers, he dealt with what took place in '63 as well. He had to grapple with that, the reality that these children's lives were just struck out of this world. And he had to grapple with it. And he made this piece called Four Sisters as they joyfully and gleefully walked towards the church, 16th Street Baptist Church. But then unknowing to them, over to the left of the compositional space, their tombstones await them. these are the things that as the artists we're grappling with. And as I think about this moment with all these Black Lives Matter issues and all the stuff that took place last summer, along with the pandemic, I've just been weighted, and the thing I felt was weary. But the thing that lifted me up in the midst of my weariness was the fact that I knew that I had to lean upon the word, and the word basically says, do not grow weary in doing good. So I continue on. As I think about John Biggers, and he travels to Africa and he finds something there. He finds a seed of information that feeds him, and he sees a connectivity to brothers that he was separated from through this heinous institution called slavery. And he taps back into that true vine, and he finds information there, and he begins to bring it back to America, and he changes the way in which he begins to do his work. He fills it up with the love and the joy and the hopefulness of what is to come, and imagining, seeing the ways in which those Black women and ways in which they held their communities together, the ways in which they worked inside those shotgun homes / church structures, and way in which they held it all together, way in which my mama got down on her knees and she began to pray for me and my siblings, and the ways in which so many people got into their churches and they professed before the Lord, and they began to shout out for joy and saying that God will save us and God will make a way. This is part of the landscape that we've been fighting. This is part of the visual depths of what we're trying to deconstruct and reconstruct and show who we are, not only to ourselves, but to the entire world. Norman Rockwell shows a little girl by the name of Ruby Bridges. Tomatoes strewn upon the wall, and as the graffiti is left behind, calling her a derogatory name. The child was 6 years old, and every day, this is what she saw. As people walked along with the images of a coffin of a Black baby inside of it. And he spoke about this idea of their white civil rights. And these are the death threats to a 6-year-old girl whose name is as beautiful as a rich jewel. The 6-year-old girl who's looked upon as an animal, who's looked upon as less than human. I step into some of my work. I made this piece several years ago. As I was reflecting, I was digging back into history that I wasn't taught in school. The history I didn't learn in elementary, that I didn't learn in high school, that for the first time I was encountering a lot of this information by going when I was in college. And it was a specific college I went to because I went to an HBCU by the name of Xavier University of Louisiana. And I remember what the conversations were like inside of the art department, speaking to each other about every little aspect of life. So much of what that experience was like inside that art department was just like being in the kitchen at my home. And I remember one of the stories we talked about was Demar Vesey. He was down in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was putting together a slave revolt that he was going to have hundreds of people involved in because they grew tired, really tired of the treatment that they were experiencing, and they had to figure a way in which to mobilize. Someone in the ranks exposed the plan, and it was thwarted. But I created an image that didn't just speak about what the African American was going through. I also begin to imagine what would happen in the mind of the person that was white to realize what they're consuming, to realize the whole construct of privilege, to wake up and to realize ways in which these racist ideological ideas have been replicated and have been repeated and have been reified in their simple acts of each day as he eats his box of cereal. When we begin to think about the foundations of wealth of this nation and whose back it gets built upon, if we look at the depths of that, perhaps our mornings with picket fences around our yards will look a little differently, and we see our neighbor a little differently. I've been grappling with as an artist and trying to figure out a way in which I could begin to use my art as a tool to begin to not only speak about the depths of the pain, but how do I use the art to speak of the joy of the space that I believe we can move into if we choose to embrace it. So I utilize the funerary tradition coming out of New Orleans called the dirge in the second line. The dirge is the mournful music played for someone who's being laid to rest. And the second line is the celebratory music that you play when a person translates from this world into the afterlife. And I begin to reflect upon how can I use my art? How can I create these visuals? How can I create these stories that can speak to the depths of what is going on? And so I thought of this piece, and it's called Bird in Hand, second line from Michigan, because I was thinking about what New Orleans was going through for many years, in particular what happened around Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I thought about what Michigan was going through because that was a space that I lived for many years, but I went to grad school there. So I kind of have a little understanding about some of the plight as we can think about the automotive industry in terms of how that falls apart. And I said, well, perhaps we can merge these cultural ideas together and we can find a place of healing together and we can be a support to one another. So as I break this image down, I created these four horsemen of the apocalypse, and they're carrying inside their hand an old 1950 Chevy Coupe, and they're carrying it away from the gravesite as if to bring it back to life. And as you move across the composition, you begin to see the musicians moving and processing in the funerary dirge through the streets, and it sounds a little like this. The brother is laying down a handkerchief upon the ground, which also has a symbolic interplay of the handkerchief as a symbol of the Holy Spirit. The X to the left is showing you the eye of the bird, which is the white handkerchief is like a dove, and he's laying it to rest. But he's also in the procession to bring it back to life, that it will be resurrected. In the middle of the composition, a brother is banging on his drum, and on it is the words Treme. Treme is the oldest African-American municipality in the United States in New Orleans, Louisiana. I purposely put a white male on a drum because I wanted to speak about the foundations of jazz, and that is the commingling of European and African traditions. And in Treme is where African Americans create the musical formation as we know as jazz and the blues, which comes from the fields and the spirituals. And that idea of the marching bands out of the white European traditions, they're linear based, whereas the African traditions are circular based. And as we move to the front, now we're feeling the sense of the second line. That is the place I'm hoping we can move to. That is a place that is hoped for. That is a space where they dance in Trinity, and the handkerchief now is animated in that it used to be an X, there now is an I that is emanating upon it and is floating up inside the air. And I told you the name of the piece is called Bird in Hand. And those of you that may be on the call that may be from Michigan or know someone from there, if you ask a person from Michigan, where did you grow up? They'll hold up their hand and they'll begin to point out that space where they grew up. The name of the bottom is called the Hand. The other part is called the Upper Peninsula, but it also had other nicknames to it. The Upper Peninsula is also known as the Bird. And the bottom part, or the mainland, is also called the Hand. I told you the name of the piece is called Bird in Hand. Second line from Michigan. I forgot to tell you how big the piece is. It's 9 feet by 20 feet in scale. It was all done in pencil. I purposely made each stroke, each cross-hatched mark to build the piece over 22 days, 150 hours and 52 pencils. The labor of love that is embedded within making the story, of bringing something that didn't exist upon the white page and putting an image that I want to see, that I believe we all should see, an image that shows us working in harmony. harmony. That is the power, I believe, of the image. And that's the images that I believe we must work to begin to shift. But we also have to shift the elements that are underneath the image, that support the image, that put it out, not only in terms of what we visually see, but what we visually feel when we see ourselves and when we look at the other. I drew from this piece by Picasso called Guernica, as he was dealing in the moment of his time, as he was dealing with the war, as they dropped a bomb on Hitler and Mussolini, dropped a bomb onto the town of Guernica just to test it out. And he creates a piece that for many years Picasso didn't even talk about. He didn't even give you the details about it, just told you the name, for you to reflect upon what took place. And again, the power of his images lasted the test of time and has traveled around the world, and hundreds of millions of people have seen it. As I use this structure to say something about right now. And I mentioned William Patterson. He was a guy that was in the Elizabeth Catlett piece. And again, I'm learning from my past, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell the stories of that past. And I'm trying to figure out the ways in which I continue to not only uplift what's going on in my own mind and how I see myself in the other, but I'm also challenging those who are dare to look and dare to witness and dare to hear the story, because this story is about a group of guys called the Trenton Six. You see, they were in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were pulled off the streets in 1948, accused of killing a white store owner. They just randomly pulled these 6 African-American men off of the street and put them in jail and put them in, I said before, a kangaroo court, and they were going to execute them. But the sister was named Bessie Mitchell, who was a seamstress who lived in New York, heard of the story, and immediately went to New Jersey and knew that her brother did not do this. She says, no way he could do it. She went to William Patterson, who was over a group that was considered to be connected to the Communist Party, and she made them work together, and they made a public, international outcry about what was taking place in that state. And the work that she did without a law degree, the sense of care and love for humanity, as she pulled that needle and that thread together, and she stitched those lives together, as she pulled them together, and she did everything she could to keep them alive. And that's what her life's work and mission became. That became her purpose for her life, was to keep them alive. Unfortunately, her brother never made it out, because he actually had contracted the disease when he was in there, and he died in prison. Hence the X's on the one character that is inside the cage, like jail cell. Or in 1955, when Rosa Parks, which I call the piece Rosa Sparks on purpose, sits down upon the Montgomery bus and refuses to give up her seat, her legs across, her arms across, her head is turned in defiance, and upon her body is the letters AOG, which stands for the armor of God, or the army of God, or the assembly of God. As you see, her feet are shod with protection, her breastplate is protecting her body, the halo about her head is protecting her mind. As she turns defiantly towards the bus driver who's trying to tell her to give up her seat, and she refuses to do so, which sparked a movement that lasted for over a year, that did not relent. And over that year's time, that it changed the system. But I must tell you that they may have changed that system, but so many of these systems are still alive and still kicking, as we saw at the Capitol, as we saw through the past 4 years, as we saw through the past 50 years. As we go back in time, you can see it over again and again, the stories being played out. Because not too long ago, before that Rosa Parks didn't refuse to give up her seat, they had a guy by the name of Emmett Till, which is on the ET on the hat over to the left of the compositional space, because that was for Emmett Till, who in 1955, Money, Mississippi, came down from Chicago, went down to go visit his cousins, and gets dragged from his house because apparently he made some gesture towards a white woman that warranted him to be killed. They beat him. They shot him. They tied his body down with an engine block and threw him into a lake. They exhumed his body 3 days later, and they shipped him back to Chicago, where the mother sees the body in the coroner's office, and she says, when we do the funeral, I want an open casket because I want everyone to see what they did to my baby. Decades of death that we as African Americans have experienced, we as Americans, we as people have experienced, because this is not separated out to us. This is all of our experience. In 1965, Malcolm X loses his life. That's the X on the hat. The crown on the guy to the left, that's from Martin Luther King, who in 68 loses his life in Memphis, Tennessee, when the assassin's bullet kills him on the porch of the Lorraine Motel. Trayvon Martin with his hoodie on, holding in his hand an Arizona tea. And the letters KOOL, that's for a pack of cigarettes. That's for Eric Garner, who said the exact same words that George Floyd said when he said, "I can't breathe." Ladies and gentlemen, these are the images that we're seeing. This is part of the story that we're all living. This is part of the systemic issues that we are all grappling with. This is the work that's in front of us when we talk about the power of images. But I do not leave you without hope as I show you the mother with the child upon her lap as she holds the book open for the child, teaching, guiding, and directing that child, feeding him in hopes that he will sit down and rise up and be active in the lives of people. This is what it looked like outside of Central High in 57, as those 9 African-American kids entered in. People yelling at them, cursing at them, death threats being thrown at these youth. Teenagers, the youngest one being 14, Kalada Wells Lanier, who is in the middle of the compositional space holding inside of her hand a science book. Atop the book is an image of Henrietta Lacks, who they extract cells from her bodies that do not die once they get out. And they use her body as to solve all kinds of medical problems and issues. But they gave no compensation to the family as doctors all around the world built their careers off of her body and built their riches off of her body. Tuskegee men are lined up behind her on the science book. Those Tuskegee men are not the airmen, but the Tuskegee men that were part of a syphilis study where they didn't give them the cure, they gave them placebo drugs and watched them die. So they can document it in the book so that we would know what happens to one over the different stages of the disease, the ways in which, again, the African American is used as a guinea pig. These things are not forgotten within the Black community. These things are embedded within the structure of the housing and the homes and the communities. This is part of the unspoken word. This is part of when African Americans speak up and speak out about issues and they're upset and angry about different things. And then people give them responses saying, well, I don't know, I didn't see, I don't understand. Listen, and you will see, you will understand. Remember, you will see, you shall understand. This is outside the schools and not far from us. This is for the Norfolk 17, and who in 1958 integrated the schools of 17 African-American kids, middle school and high school, entered into the schools. They came in with their culture and their spirituality. They came in with their economics. They came in with a song upon their sleeves. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. They came in with the protection of the Holy Spirit, which is symbolized by the dove floating up above them as the shadow is on the ground inside of the compositional space. These 4 men leave out of their school at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they go down to the Woolworth and they say, serve me, I am a human, I have money, I should be sitting at this counter and not going to the back of the bus and not going to the back of the store. I should be able to be served right just like you are. They went there and put themselves on the front line. But one of the key elements I put inside this composition is really over to the right, as I show you the woman who's in contemplation with the word worth above her head, because she has to not only define the worth of these men as she's told not to serve them, but she has a dilemma inside of her body because she perhaps feels in her heart that she should, because they are human. And perhaps she's now dealing with or grappling with the issue that she may have to put her own job on the line. That becomes part of our issue as we deal with these different things that are going on in society. Is like, how much are we willing to lose? How much are we willing to give up? That goes back to that museum who wants to keep its core base because they're worrying about what they're going to lose and not seeing about what they gain by really building an institution that's based upon the true diversity and the true connectivity and the trueness of who we all are together as an entire body, working together in harmony, that you're not losing, you're gaining. That's part of that greed matrix that's worrying about this loss that's really not real. But it was real for Amadou Diallo on that day in 1999 as they stood on that porch. I contemplated the story over and over again in my head because I replaced him with myself many times. See, Amadou Diallo was on this porch and he was backlit, and 4 police officers in plain clothes came up to him and said that he was a guy that did some series of crimes in the community. As he was trying to pull out his wallet to identify himself, they thought he was pulling out a gun and they shot at him altogether 41 times. 41 bullets rang out at him and hit him with over 50% of the bullets, killing Amadou that day and finding out that he did not have a gun and finding out that he was not the assailant. I was making a larger statement, a double statement, one of the ways in which African-American men and women are commodified within this nation, looked upon as a product still. That's why the names of Jim Beam, Smirnoff, AOL, McDonald's, Seagrams are all plastered upon his body. But I also make a larger statement to say that we as Americans must get up from our pregnant tables overflowing with bounty and be active in the lives of people regardless of race, representation, or social and economic class. As the table is literally a pregnant woman. It's hard to see, but she's there. If you look at her head, at the bottom of the composition, her breasts are right above, and then her belly is above that, and her left leg is with spikes, her right leg is with spikes, and in the middle is a vaginal region with an umbilical cord going up to the full-grown young man inside of a cruciform standing at the table. The 2 people are sitting eating a good old American meal of chicken and French fries. Oh, the bullets are littered upon the ground, 38 of them. But you're saying your math is off. 39, 40, and 41 are the shapes of the cells at the top of the composition, because I'm speaking about the prison industrial complex that is going on, where we have men and women who are rotting away inside of jail cells all across our nation. But we have the keys. If you look on his hip to the bottom left, we have the keys in which we can break down these cycles. It has to be done together. You can't see him as other. You got to see him as brother. You got to see him as son, as uncle, as cousin, as neighbor. And when I think about this piece here, this one here, it's called a jazz song, A Lot of Blue Notes. A friend of mine said that this is something that Barack Obama said. A jazz song with a lot of blue notes about the African-American experience. One of the most important parts in this composition is at the bottom for me. When I put Black figures and white figures, not just simply as a tessellation in terms of design, but I was putting them there because I thought about the slavery system in our nation. And we think about maybe one may have been enslaved physically, but another has been enslaved ideologically. Therefore, we both are slaves or enslaved by these various issues that are happening around in our societal structure. To the right side of the composition, I ponder another element there. As I show you a woman working the fields picking tobacco. Now, one of the constructs is that she was chattel. On the books, she was just a product, something to be bought and sold, but yet the slave master slept with her, impregnated her, and created a child with her. So I show her transforming from a mule into a woman, which I'm pulling from Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their eyes are watching God. The nigger woman is the mule of the world as far as I can see. As I show you transforming slowly into a woman and fighting back against those constructs, the ways in which gynecological studies were done upon the Black woman that basically said that she didn't experience pain, and thinking of her thresholds of pain. The hypersexual nature and the constructions of Black men and Black women have been pervasive throughout a societal structure. But then I remember the words of Barack Obama, and he said, yes, we can. And I remember that moment, and people were basically espousing these ideas that we were post-racial. What an insane construct. How do we move to the space of post-racialness so fast? Did we grapple with all the issues? And the answer is obviously before us. And the answer is no, we have not. But it was a step, I would say. I'm calling out for communal resurrection. We've seen it happen before our eyes because I am a product of that communal resurrection. I think about those mothers who worked those fields, who toiled night and day, who dreamed of having freedom, who dreamed of being able to have a home and property, who dreamed of having an education, who dreamed of being able to move where they wanted to go. I can hear those mothers singing from the fields, I'm free, praise the Lord, I'm free, no longer bound. I can hear those songs because they're part of my DNA. As I know that those sounds from that fields to the present and the formations of hip hop music, I know that they're still alive right now because you're talking about musical forms and idioms that are created that have been exported around the world that have transformed music as we know it. Brothers and sisters taking sounds from records and scratching them and reverbing them together. A hip hop, a hippie to the hippie to hip, hip, a hop, you don't stop, but rocking to the bang bang, boogie, sit up, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat. Oh, they're taking all that information and it's pushing around from generation to generation. As Minnie Riperton is singing to you, loving you is easy cause you're beautiful. As she sings upon the stage, as we move closer to that sound, to that healing, to that restoration, as we move together, as we use the music as a healing balm to help us make it through those church songs, still singing and still hear Mahalia singing from the hilltop, crying out from her lungs. Oh, I hear them all. As we see the brother playing on the piano in his house structure as a topic, he's playing his community. Oh, I hear old brother John Coltrane on his horn. A love supreme, a love supreme, and Art Blakey playing. I still hear them, guys. I still hear them. I still hear Esperanza Spalding, who's carrying on that tradition. A love supreme, a love supreme. Oh, communal resurrections. Oh, it's about time together. It's the love in which we share. It's about do what you wanna, hang out on the corner. It's that ribbon of love that touches those housing projects in New Orleans, that ribbon of love that touches those housing projects in Chicago. It's that ribbon of love that touches Sing Sing, those who are trapped away in penitentiaries and who are trapped from their families, and families' lives are disrupted in ways in which family structures are laid to rest. And how do we come together to fill in the gaps? That's part of the work. That's part of the work. That's part of the work. The Links Project was one of the works that we did here in Williamsburg together. Over 500 people come together, 20 different countries, made the individualized pieces, embracing the 1619 to 2019, the 400 years of chattel slavery in America. We stood in the face of it together outside the Wren Building, which is the longest, oldest continuous academic building on any college campus in the United States. And we utilized the age, the old, and the young together to carve their pieces. And we worked together inside of workshops, over 30 of them together, and we inked it up together, and we placed the paper down down and we ran the steamroller over it together and we pulled the paper back together and we took our pictures and our selfies together and we went out together and we saw the forms and we looked at the work that we did together and we put it in the museum together and we worked as the links, not as a symbol of incarceration or slavery, but as a symbol of our interconnectedness that's inextricable. We did it together. As we work together, as we fish together, we teach another generation how to seek for knowledge, how to seek for truth. As we do this together, we sow the seeds within our families. As I begin to reflect upon my great grandmother, who escaped from indentured servitude by hiding her 2 kids underneath her hoop dress. My great grandmother walked to freedom, and one of those children was my grandmother, who my grandmother gives birth to my mother, who gives birth to my older sister, who pass upon to them that whole quilting tradition. And in that quilting tradition, she teaches us about the pieces, the fragments of your life and how you pull them together and how you stay together and how you work through the issues. We can learn so much from each other. We can understand what it truly means to recycle. And we can remember to remember. Because we can look back and we can see flashes of us working together and connected. And the question is, who is my neighbor? You're my neighbor. Yes. You're my neighbor. Yes. You're my neighbor. Peace be with you. Thank you.
Steve, I don't have any idea how to respond to that. If anyone has comments or questions, you can use the chat feature to pass them along, and I will read them to Steve if I can. I'm not sure my voice is going to allow me to. I will, Steve, if you don't mind me asking, the 1967 image, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the artist or the name of the piece, but it was the one in Detroit.
Faith Ringgold.
Faith Ringgold, okay. As soon as I saw that, and I looked at it, and I realized, and I may have missed something, that that only the white man in that picture is armed. He's got a gun and a knife, and as soon as I saw that, I immediately thought of Denmark Vesey's church, the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about Faith Ringgold's can you tell us anything about the creation of that image?
No,
when she did it, or
I don't know a whole lot about the creation of that piece, but the connection that you made about the Mother Emanuel Church, I had that in my presentation. I actually took it out. It was going to take me down another path, but I grappled with the Mother Emanuel Church, especially as related to Denmark Vesey. And Denmark Vesey, who in 1822, who creates this slave revolt that was thwarted, that church is the same church that he helped found, that he's connected to.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time period, when it happened, that church was closed for a while, and many of the congregation members left Charleston, and they actually went to Philadelphia, and they ended up connecting with Bethel, Mother Bethel, which was the first church that was started by the AME Church that's there. And then, of course, they eventually went back, and of course, they called it Mother Emanuel. In 2015 is when that when the 9 African Americans were killed during Bible study. and one of them being the pastor, and a woman who was 87 years old, and her grandson, which was 22 years old.
Mhm.
And I worked with this artist by the name, he's a musician artist by the name of Hannibal Okambe, and we created a piece called Crucifixion Resurrection, Nine Souls Are Traveling. And so it's a traveling piece that's both musical and visual arts combined. And I've created these stained glass window-like configurations that basically represent the translation of those African Americans into a sainthood. And they each have a window that's designed for them and that speaks about their lives. And so we've gone to 3 different cities with it already. One was in Philadelphia, where it premiered at Mother Bethel Church. Then we took it to New Orleans, we went to St. Augustine Church, and then we took it to Fisk University. And it was slated to go to Chicago, but pandemic hit, and so it did not make it up there yet. So, but it's one that's going to travel all across the nation, spreading that message, that's spreading the history in the ways in which I talked about this idea of the dirge. But it also is going to spread the history about, again, this a profession of love, of self, of community, and a cry out for a deeper, more meaningful communal gathering and so forth. So that's my work is dedicated towards.
Okay.
And as I work with, I look at different artists like Faith Ringgold, look at Charles White, I look at Elizabeth Callada. There's a whole host of artists that I didn't put in this presentation because I literally could have just been showing you the images, all the negative images of the historical past and present. But I chose to just show you a few of them just to set the stage, but also just show you the beauty that artists have made in creating these images and fighting against these negative constructions and the ways in which the visual artists are working. And I mainly focus on the visual artists because they're photographers. I could have gone to Gordon Parks and could have gone to a whole bunch of other different people that are doing so many things to fight against these issues. And the call out ultimately is that one, for us to all collectively come together again, and that we all have to collectively come to the table. And it's just a cry out for the work that needs to be done, and that it won't happen overnight. That is something that's sustained and that may not happen in our lifetime, but it's something we have to plant seeds to pass on to the next generation.
We did have a question come in from Jenny Dreyer. She said many of these pieces seem to focus on hands and feet, and in some cases are exaggerated in their portrayal. Is there a significance in this?
Absolutely. There's a long history as to African American art where there has been accentuation, in particular to the hands, because the hands they're so important. I don't know if you know the song by Bill Withers called Grandma's Hands. And if you
No
don't,
others by him, but not that one.
Yeah, but if you look that song up and you listen to the words, he talks about grandma's hands, but he also talks about the multiple ways in which the hands work and operate. Not only did it work, not only did they cook the food, but the hands also chastise. The hands also lift up. They also coddle. They also support. They're loving. They're loving and supportive hands. They're praying hands. And so the hands stand out. And so therefore, I take the time to put into those, and they sometimes get exaggerated within the compositional space as to pay homage to the ancestors of who did so much before us and the ways in which they had to use their hands so much in terms of their everyday life. But it's also bespeaking of that which we have to do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And how important they are in terms of being able to use them and so forth on all those different aspects of life,
Well, another question from me. Your pieces are so rich with images that are, I don't know what another word to say, but packed onto the canvas. When you are constructing them, I mean, I imagine you're constructing them before you start, but are you ever moved in the middle or to add another element to it because you think it has power that you hadn't originally conceived of?
Yes, absolutely. That happens all the time in the creative process. I don't know how many other creatives that are on here right now, but many creatives can tell you that the creative process it's happening at all times. Before you make the piece, while you're making a piece, and even after the piece is quote unquote completed. You're constantly having a conversation with that which you've made. And, you know, I mean, people liken the idea that, you know, their artwork is their baby. Of course, that's really a stretch. It is definitely not a child. But nonetheless, it has some of the components of that, in terms of the fact that you have brought something into existence that wasn't here before. And that it's an idea that's conceived in your mind that now is committed to canvas, committed to a sculpture, committed to a photograph or whatever, a painting, and so forth. So I'm a big stickler for the sketchbook, and ideas come to me all the time. Sometimes ideas came to me in the midst of just talking today, and sharing, and ideas in the ways in which I think about the work and so forth. So that process, that creative process, never stops. Even the way in which I talked about them, I basically cut through them and I only share with you just a few elements in them. Because my works, I work off of a construct called the dense pack. Now, the dense pack is basically mean that I'm forcing into the compositional space a lot of information, and therefore it affects the viewer response time. That basically means that you can't see it all, you can't get it all, because I reduce the image to just one singular thing for you to grapple with. Even that could be complicated in and of itself, just the one singular thing, because of the layers in terms of what you do at surface, in terms of the clothing and the texture and the posture and in the space where you put it or the lack thereof. All those things communicate something to you. And so by me putting a complicated figure in one structure and then putting multiple complicated figures around it, you now have to sift through it and you have to go through it slower. And therefore, people have told me that they've seen stuff in my works weeks and months and years later. And because I'm dealing with what's also called a polynarrative. So I'm not just simply dealing with one narrative, it's one narrative stacked on top of the other. So in the process of making, I'm literally, and I'm really mean it, I'm literally having a conversation with the piece. And there are things that I don't put in that I actually take out that I originally was going to put in. And I remove them. And because something tells me internally that, you know, you don't need to say that, or that's not ready for that, or no, that needs this. And so you having this conversation, and it's a balancing act, you know, it's a balancing act in terms of design and construction, in terms of that. And so I'm saying all these things about just by talking about an art piece, would say we put that same level of intent and action to each other, that I look at you that actively, and that you look at me that actively, and that we don't just sit and just deal with just the surface and just those little simple things, and we don't just continue to just gloss over things, or we don't take the time to have compassion for one another, to seek each other out and to seek out the understanding, and not be afraid of saying the wrong thing, not being afraid to offend, not to offend just to offend, but offend in the sense that sometimes we do it unintentionally. And it's okay that if we do it unintentionally, because I think the person on the other end, yeah, they might be upset with what you said and they might call you on it, they might check you on it. But the thing is that if you have a true relationship, then the relationship will survive it. And it will survive it, and you'll move past it, and you'll remember it together. You say, man, you remember when I said such and such to you? And, you know, we might even joke about it, that you said such and such to me. But we have come to an understanding of each other that's built on true connectivity and so forth. So art, I believe, teaches us that, and images teaches us that. And I think that so many people have utilized images and imagery in such a way as to support whatever they want to get across, whether they want to make more riches, where they want to demean a particular group. You know, you think about the whole construct of slavery is, as the text basically talks about, you know, when it talks about that, is that they put systems in place to construct a Black person as a particular thing, to say that it's not as intelligent as another person, you know, to say that it, you know, and then he came up with all kind of laws and rules that was taught in the schools, you know, for years, for centuries. And then you talk about, we to this point right now, no, we talking about, we got to unlearn centuries of misinformation, you know. And then, like, you know, there's an album by what's her name, Lauryn Hill, you know, it's called The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. You know, and it's a profound album, you know, but it's a profound statement of the name of the album, The Miseducation, because that's what I felt when I got to Xavier University. You know, I've said it in lectures before, you know, and I love my art teacher from high school. She taught me so much. Matter of fact, I spoke about her today. But I remember she told me about, I had asked a question about all the pyramids and the different statues, and like, why are the noses knocked off of them? And she tells me it was wind erosion. And so I went off believing that was wind erosion that took those things off. I get to college, my professor laughs at me. I'm like, what are you laughing at? A teacher told me in high school that those are wind erosion. It's like, nah, they were knocked off because of Afrocentroid features. I'm like, what? That's part of that miseducation. It's like waking up. It's like, what? Why? That makes you angry because you're like, dang, how many lies did you teach me? And that's what I brought up out in that piece, Non-Little Indians, which is the image about the Little Rock Nine integrated public schools in Arkansas. And that's why I put that science book there, because that was stuff that was in their same time period that was not in their books. They weren't teaching them about the Tuskegee experiments. Matter of fact, at that point in time, it hadn't been exposed, but it was going on at the same time. They didn't learn anything about no Gila or what was going on with Henrietta Lacks and so forth. That didn't come out into into the 70s. So there's all this hidden information, and you got these kids that are going into this education system and trying to get an education. Not only were they dealing with the stuff on the outside, they were dealing with stuff on the inside of the school. So it wasn't like they just got into school and like, ooh, my God, there's some crazy people out there. No, it was like right behind them as soon as they walked in. And they got into the classrooms, it was right there. They go to the gym, it was right there. Matter of fact, one student didn't get a chance to make it through because she got in a fight with a kid in the gym. And what were the African Americans told to do? Don't cause trouble when you go to school. Like, what? Don't cause trouble. If you cause any trouble, we're going to put you out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what about the people that cause trouble to me? Are they going to get put out? No, that's part of those codes. Even the book talks about that. About how, remember the one element early in the book when they talk about this idea of poor whites and poor blacks working together. And what did they do? They basically created a different code system for those who are poor, and those they said to the poor whites, you might be poor, but you're still better than that black person. And that's an unwritten rule that has lasted for centuries, alive and kicking. So don't, let's not sit in no fog and think that it's not real. It's real. And this is part of the anger. This is part of the angst. This is part of the frustration that African Americans express over and over again for years. And people say, well, what you all uptight for? This is part of why I get in an argument with a dude on Facebook, which I shouldn't waste my time, but I did, because we argued about this. But now he's mighty silent right now, especially after the insurrection on the Capitol. I ain't heard from him. I want to go back, but I don't want to egg at him because I'm not being spiteful, but I ain't forget. Let's put it that way. All right. But I remember he was, what happened to George Floyd? He should have been compliant. He wouldn't have been, nothing would have happened to him. Like, what?
They dragged him out of the car.
He should have been compliant, though.
But they dragged him out of the car. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to get into the argument with him.
That was the argument I had with this guy. He said that he should have been compliant there, so therefore he would have lived. I was like, what? And then I went on and on. We went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then finally I just said, it's enough of this. I said, obviously, you're not seeing anything and you're not trying to see anything. And therefore, I'm going to back off. And he's like, and one of the last things he said, I believe that we could be friends. No, I don't know about that. But let me be honest. I don't know if we're going to hang out because we're going to be arguing all the time.
Well, as we're talking, if anyone else has any questions or comments that they'd like to make, please use the chat to do that. One of the other things that I'd like to ask while I have the microphone and waiting for other people to contribute, it seems like there was a lot of imagery that came out of George Floyd's murder and the subsequent expression of anger across the country. What if you were to travel across the country to try to collect those images, where would you want people to see them? Would you like to see them gathered in a central location, or would you like to see them replicated in other places? Should they be in public? Should they be curated? Can we treat it as art, or can can we just look at it as a movement, a one-time expression?
That's that's a complicated. I need to think about that for a
And I'm
minute.
not sure I even expressed what
Yeah.
I wanted to say.
I guess my first response, I'll tell you what my heart is, and I might change my mind on this, but my heart response is that I don't think we need to put it through the curatorial lenses that way in which we normally see things. I think that's part of the problem, and that we don't need to put into the structure. I think we need to also open the field for where something falls out of that structure, and that we allow things to happen. I think that's happening in Richmond. You know, right around the was it the Andrew Jackson statue? Am I
Mhm.
right? Yeah. And what took place outside of that, and where you had people tagging that thing and painting all over it, projecting on it at nighttime. They had parties and they're cooking, grilling out there. They're teaching dance classes, yoga classes, all kinds of stuff. You know, was taking place outside of there. And so to the point where people are going up to the statue and they're taking graduation pictures. I can guarantee you folks when going in front of that statue taking some graduation pictures before they had it all tagged up the way they did. So it's really what ended up happening is you have this grassroots artistic expression of all different forms collide at this moment, and of frustration, but it turned into this kind of idea of communal gathering. It wasn't just like they were out there just wrecking and running the homes down. And one of the big issues becomes is that there's a lot of fear in face of that. Fear, and also a fear of losing what they have. And so some of the people's argument that live in a community to see that statue go, many of the people are worrying about their property values going down if they remove the statue out of the space, because they know that these statues, it raises a certain status and it raises our property to a particular way or particular space. So therefore, we want to maintain it, we want to keep our wealth. And so that's another big issue that we have going on. You know, that's why I put that in that piece with dealing with the Diana Woodworth, and I put that word worth because that's where a lot of the key is at right there. It's dealing with money, it's dealing with work, it's dealing with inheritance, and so forth. And people don't want to mess with that, and they're afraid of losing it. So to even a playing field out, man, when you talk about the playing field, it's so skewed. And as African Americans, we're so far behind on that playing field. It's not, it's the word scary is not even adequate to basically say where we're at because of the years and centuries of misappropriation, of blockades, of all kinds of issues, things systemically put in our way as obstacles to stop us from being able to gain and to build inheritance and so forth. You know, for many years, I'm telling you, watching the show called what's that? Traveling Road Show that's on PBS. What's
The
that?
Antiques Roadshow.
Yeah, that thing used to bother me for years because I think about people in the African American community. We ain't got all that stuff in our head. You know, that's not stuff that we have that's been passed on that way. You know, in many instances in terms of the African American community, you know, and so forth. And so it just becomes a gross. It becomes a gross imbalance of between have and have-nots in terms of that. But I'm not gonna sleep on the wealth that we do have, you know, and we have a great amount of it. And that's with the artwork like a Catlett or John Biggers or a Charles White. And I'm trying to work in that line is to purport that level of wealth that we have and that we have used and that has sustained us. That's the reason why I'm here right now, because of what people did before me and so forth. And so therefore I feel the great charge, you know, to carry the moniker, carry the banner, and to do my part. And that's what I encourage others to do, you know. So I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm like, no, I'm putting my hand out. I'm reaching out. I want to connect. You know, I'm here in this community. I know that it's not by accident, it's for a reason. And why I'm here. And so while the little time that we here on this earth, you know, what do we do with this little bit of life that we have? You know, I mean, the larger scheme of things is really a blip of time. It's like a life of a fly, you know.
Everything is vanity.
It's grass.
We have a couple of other questions. First one from Lisa Green, and then I'm going to ask Carrie Cooper if she will unmute herself and ask her question. And Carrie, you can direct message me or Tammy and let me know if you want us to read it for you. But Lisa Green said, I was struck during the Links project by your deep trust in the wisdom of the community in creating the woodcuts, making the print, even driving the bulldozer. Where do you think that trust comes from, and have you always had it?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I think I have the answer. That's in me. I had to search myself. I think that a lot of it comes from teaching. I've been an educator for many years and working with different age levels. And I've been asked this question because I've taught middle school, high school, and community college, 4-year private and 4-year public over a course of 22 years. And people ask me all the time, they say, hey, which group do you like to work with the best? And I said, all of them. That's the big general question answer that I give. But I really like I like to work with the teenage level. I think as far as a teacher, I think I'm most effective as a high school teacher. And the reason why I believe that is because that was my most traumatic moment in my life, where I was grappling with the deepest stuff in myself. I was dealing with the deepest level of insecurity at that moment in my life. And so therefore, I know what it's like to be on the other side of that. And so when I see a student that's grappling and going through some of those same things that I went through, I can identify with them. And then I'm also be able to look at them, and I'm also able to say to them, it's going to be all right. Then the other thing is, the answer to that question, Lisa, is that it's by design. I create the design parameters of the project. And so the greatest work that I do is before I start doing a project. I work out everything as much as I possibly can. Now, of course, I can't account for everything because there are things that are going to happen that I don't anticipate, but I work out most of it before I start working with everybody. And then I make some adjustments as we go along, and then we pick up on things and we say, oh, okay, you saw what happened? All right, let's not do that again. Let's do this. And then so that trust is partly by design and partly in knowing that as a teacher, I know how to guide you and direct you, and I know how to feed you just enough information. Now, you think about the Links project, what the thing is I know was going to work in terms of design is it works off of the concept, and I've said it before in other lectures, is this idea of if you put 3 people in front of an audience and you tell them to sing, and if they can't sing, they're exposed. And depending on what audience they're in front of, they're going to get booed.
Yeah.
Some audiences they'll get in front of, oh, that was so precious, and you're like, oh my God, that was terrible. Like, when is the song over? And then, but if you put 2,000 people and tell them to sing something, there is no bad voice. You're going to be moved by the sheer power of the group, of the mass. And that's the design element that project works off of. It's the mass. It's all of us working together. That's where the beauty is at. The beauty is in the individual, but it's so much more beautiful. It's amplified when you got all of it together. Now, me as the artist, I put it into a shape. I form it. And that's the control that I exert onto it. So therefore, the beauty is amplified by my skill and my training to be able to extract that out of people. So that's where the trust comes in at. And I just believe that, and I take the pressure off people. They be like, oh, I don't want to mess it up. And my one piece is going to be the terrible one. And everybody's going to say, they ain't going to see your piece. They're just going to get lost.
Take yourself so seriously.
Yeah, when I take that pressure off of them, then they can just make and create. And then many times what ends up happening is they end up making something that's really nice and they like it. They're like, oh my God, this is the best art piece I ever made, And then part of that, again, I'm teaching, I'm guiding, I'm directing, I'm encouraging, I'm setting little seeds in the air. And most times I'm just getting out of the way, We all have an innate sense of design. And one of the greatest principles that we have as designers is balance. And that's the hardest thing for us to achieve.
Carrie, do you want to go ahead and ask Steve your question while I'm trying to find my balance?
Sure, sure. Steve, that was just beautiful. I've been to presentations that you've given before, and the words, it's poetry and it's art, and you sing, and tonight you played music, jazz. It's just so beautiful. So I just want to say thank you. And I just share with us, does that just come out of you must be so exhausted after, I just feel like it's such it's just, you give us so much. It's got to be exhausting for you. So I'm wondering about your energy level and how you save it for a night like tonight to do what you just did. And I just wonder if you write the words down. Those are the two things. I know we're supposed to be ending, but I'd love to hear that real quick.
No, that's no problem. I'm good in terms of time. Thank you for the question, Carrie, and thank you for your words. One, I do not write down what I said to you. Everything came straight from the heart. I have the ability, I create an outline in my head, what I'm going to say. And I build it on the images. I'm so visually weighted, it don't make any sense. So when I look at the visual, it evokes the words that I want to say. And then I also rely on the spirit of the moment to say what comes out of my heart, and just allow that to flow. And so I pray before I start speaking, and I pray for that level of clarity and to be able to express in that manner. And so I still myself before I start talking, and so forth. And what was the other first part of the question you asked?
I asked how
By channel.
your the level of the energy level, I guess, and how exhausting it must be for you.
It's I guess I don't feel it as being really too exhausting because I've done it for a long time. I've done a lot of talking, a lot of lectures, a lot of programs, and it's more exhilarating and energizing than it is exhausting. Of course, there's a little bit of a crash that I go through after doing it. You kind of sit down on the couch and you just kind of rest a minute, but then I just get up and keep going. I did a talk this morning at 9 o'clock this morning for a school in Asheville, North Carolina. And so I talked to middle schoolers just this morning and so forth. And then I got back to preparing for my talk for this evening and so forth. But this is, I believe that this is what I was called to do. And so therefore it's not, I can't say it's easy. It's not easy, but it's not hard.
Wow.
It's natural.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
for me to share.
Okay, I'm going to give it back to you, Andrew.
I feel completely at home, and just, and a lot of it has to do with, like I said, got past my high school self, is that I am completely comfortable in my skin.
Yeah.
That goes a long way when you just comfortable with who you are.
So if you could go back to your high school, middle school self and introduce that young man to Stamped or any of the ideas in Stamped, what would you like to have been able to hear or tell yourself about what you read in the book?
Yeah, I guess I don't. I guess my brain automatically goes to something more communal, and that I desire that I had a more loving and protective environment to grow in. That's what I desire, and I didn't have that coming up, and there's damages that I received along the way, and I'm not spiteful about the damages, but I recognize them and I see them, and I know where those damages and those flaws within myself, and ways in which it shaped me, and ways in which it shaped the way in which I think about myself. And I had to do so much deprogramming of that. I was very thankful to have a family, in particular my mom and my dad and my siblings, who was that rock. I had that place to go back home to, that constantly reinforced who we were, to say that we were beautiful, to say that we were smart, to say that we can do anything if we put our mind to. I had that level of reinforcement, but I also had too the realities of glass ceilings, closed doors, and things along the way because of the choices that I made and the choices that I do as an artist. I know that my artwork that I do is not the most palatable for everyone, and I've had people tell me to my face that I love your work, but I couldn't put it on my wall, and a lot of it has to do with it's grappling or dealing with the depth of what I just shared with you. And that by not you putting on your wall, that wall becomes symbolic of that's you in you. You're afraid to embrace that thing that's not only affecting me, it's affecting you too, and to embrace it to that level. And so when I think about this information, as we talk about this stuff, I don't want to think about it just from the individual level, because we're all in this together. It's affecting everybody. If we think about slavery, it just does not affect the African American. We think about what the conquest took place in this nation, it just not affect the Native American. It's a long line of people that have fallen like dominoes throughout time, throughout history, that are feeling the reverberations of this, and it's going forward. The next generation is going to feel what we're experiencing right now, And this time ain't no worse than no other time. It's time. And people say, "Oh, we live in some of the worst days of our lives." No, I mean, I guess our lives we are. That's relative to us. But shoot, just go back in history. Just peek back one generation. You don't have to look that far to know, that there's been challenges and great, almost insurmountable types of challenges that have taken place for every generation. And the thing is, this is our time. It's our time right now, what we have to deal with as a people. And so there's an urgency in our time. So that's why I use the symbol of the bee, because the bee is diligent. It works. And that's what we got to do. We got to work. So.
Well, I think that's a fine note to end on. And I would like to express my appreciation, the appreciation of the people who have been working on the One Book, One Community program. I know that I've been looking forward to this, since you and I first started talking about it.
Yeah.
And so I think, art is a great foundation for us to use to get to work. So thank you again. Thank you all for attending. And wow, I think. Well, anyway, I just don't know what to say. I mean, this was a wonderful, wonderful evening, and I appreciate it so much.
I appreciate you right back. I thank everyone for coming out this evening and just listening. And so I look forward to our paths crossing out there on the crossroads, and I look forward to doing the work together with you and continue to just challenge not only ourselves but challenge each other, and be like that last piece I shared with you. Let's tie together. Let's be a link one unto the other.
Yes. Well, lots of messages coming in from people saying thank you. Reminder, and I do hope that you'll come back and join us with Jason Reynolds. Boy, I'd like to be a fly on the wall and get the two of you together to talk books and art.
No, that'd be wonderful. I would love that.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the talk. I have it on my calendar. I don't think I have a conflict, so I'm looking forward.
22nd on Monday, and then, well, on a personal note, when you were talking about your opening story, which was absolutely beautiful, I remembered that I have, and I don't know if you can see this T-shirt.
Pull up a little higher.
From.
Okay, I see it.
Florian.
Oh wow!
You mentioned that, and I thought, hey, I've got that.
Wow! No, I went there. I won a competition with the Partners of the Americas. Are you part of that?
No.
Oh no. Okay, yeah. Because